To introduce the 5 panelists who are highly experienced, all of them, great expertise in understanding the public opinion and captivating or capturing what people say, what people reflect, based on the topic for this agenda, which is the well-being, what the people say about well-being. Therefore, we will start the session with the participation of Mr. Pablo Diego Rosell. Mr. Pablo Diego is a senior consultant that works for Gallup. Gallup being a research agency, highly renowned worldwide. He has been working in research for the past 10 years. This is international research he has carried out. He's one of the leaders of the World Well-being of Gallup Index, and he has led research projects, but from a quantitative as well as a qualitative perspective in different countries, especially in countries within the Latin American region, as well as African countries. He has a PhD in social psychology, graduated from the Osto University in Bilbao, Spain. So, please welcome Mr. Pablo Diego Rosell. Good day, everybody. I do hope that you are revitalized after that tremendously great yoga session we had. And I would like to, first and foremost, thank the State of Jalisco for this cordial invitation, and also my compliments to all of you and all the experts that are gathered here today during this forum. This is a unique type of event. Next slide, please. I would like to mention the Worldwide Well-being Survey by Gallup. This is not the first time that you hear about this Gallup survey, and that's not a coincidence. This is probably one of the greatest coverage in terms of the approach and scope that the Gallup survey has. This is a philosophy that I can sum up in George Gallup's words. And I quote, "If democracy is expression of the will of the citizens, nobody should be in charge of finding out what that will is." And I end the quote. So George Gallup's survey and his comment go in aiming at a solution to this question. This is the 2005 World Poll. We have Danny Kahneman, Mr. Diener, and people like Angus Deaton, who are highly renowned and greatly prestigious researchers when it comes to behavioral surveys in developing countries, and so forth. So they helped us out work on this survey, and it has been around since 2006, and 48% of the population of the world is what has been surveyed, and we have somewhere around 1,000 to 4,000 interviews on a year basis, and this is on a country-to-country basis as well. Now, analyze, please, these figures I am sharing with you. So 48% of the population is somehow represented on the Gallup World Poll. Now, maybe you can tell me which country is not indicated here. Somalia, North Korea. We have not reached those countries yet, but so far 164 countries. And we, of course, look forward to getting to those countries that are complicated, for example, North Korea, or maybe very minor countries, for example, Papua Guinea, that has very minor population numbers. However, all in all, we cover most of the world. Now, the results were published at the State of Global Well-being, which is available over the internet if you want to have access to the portal. And in this report, we, of course, include all the 5 well-being dominions that we consider the most important ones. and relevant figures that pertain to the results. This is a model that we developed from the Gallup platform. It's different from models that I have noticed during the presentations given during this past 2 days and a half. Now, in addition to the World Welfare Report, we provide information to many entities, think tanks, worldwide organizations, development banks, multilateral banks, and organizations. They all report their own surveys. I could mention the Global Findex, which is a financial index, globalized information. We also have the Better Life Index from the OECD. This is part of the OECD, referring to quality of life with multiple variables, and they also include the subjective well-being. We also have the Voices of the Hungry. This is a project that we launched in cooperation with the FAO under the United Nations, and for the first time ever, we understand the hungry or the hunger-related conditions and how the voices can be represented. There's other entities that, of course, use these numbers and all resonate the well-being status. Now we have an online tool. This is for consultation purpose. This is the Gallup Analytics. This tool allows us to work on references regarding the survey, as well as additional surveys, analysis, and segregations based on demographics, for example, age, gender, socioeconomic level, and so forth. And you can have a subscription to this Gallup Analytics. Many universities and companies that work on international scenarios try to get hold of this type of tool because of its usefulness. During our survey, of course, we have a number of variables. I will focus on the most important ones, which are the global well-being. Global well-being, which can be divided into objective or subjective variables. The objective include, of course, something that has been mentioned quite intensely, the classic well-being, for example, the per capita income, educational level, employment or unemployment, as well as poverty indexes. So all are mandated when analyzing this objectively, but subjectively, that have been mentioned before as well, are well known by all of you. Well, we have the life evaluation or assessment, which is a global way to understand our life. Then we have the experiment or experience-based well-being. For example, what happened one day before, whether they are positive or negative, and we include that as well. And then we have the 5 well-being dominions that I referred before to. These are concrete areas. We, of course, include the social well-being, we include the community well-being, and more concrete and actionable, if you will, aspects. When we talk about life evaluation, we can use this scale that has been used quite extensively about. This is the Cantril scale. And this rank analyzes our well-being from 0 to 10 today. So 0 is the worst possible and 10 is the best possible, attainable life quality. And then life in 5 years or within a 5-year range. So where will you be? How will you feel in 5 years? And once again, 0 to 10. The worst and the best, respectively. So we put people on this ladder. This is a ladder that helps us understand from 5 to 7 where they are, or 8 to 10 in 5 years are people that are prospering. Those that are under 5 to both questions are suffering as we speak. And those that have this inferior per capita income and educational level that is also a low one. So objective conditions that are related to these variables. Now those that are not on either group are fighting. They are in a constant struggle or fight to move forward. Then we have the experience-based positive results. We have seen many models, many types of experience-based well-being. We gathered 5 positive ones and 5 negative ones. And amongst the positive ones, we have joy, we have laughing or smiling, feeling rested or at peace, and feeling treated with respect. We have the Japanese ambassador with due respect by President Barack Obama. And finally, learning something interesting. So these are the positive experience-based entities. These are on a binary code, 0 or 1. Did you experience any of these emotions yesterday? And you just answer a yes or a no. I would like to underscore the importance of this element. We work worldwide. We have to ask questions that have to be better understood by everybody. Oftentimes we work on complex scales or scoring cards that are so complicated that when you travel around the world you might not understand. For example, sub-Saharan Africa, and the educational level is very low. These scales is something they are not familiarized with. And we talk about binary codes, and then you have a yes or a no, which is very simple to use, especially when we're talking about worldwide experience. For example, Margarita Tarragona, during the first day, showed pictures, and she would ask the people what type of emotion that was. And this is a classic paradigm of emotion-based psychology by Paul Ekman, and these are emotions that are recognized in the world, throughout the world. Anybody can recognize either one or any of this. And we have these 5 positive experiences that are universally recognized or acknowledged. The negative ones, of course, are also known. We have stress or tension, we have pain, sadness, concern or worrisome, and anger or rage. Now, this angry face is not something I would like to leave you with, so let's go to joy. Let's go to this very nice slide. As I was mentioning, these positive positive experiences are aggregated to this binary code. So, for example, we have a scale from 0 to 10, and the weight is on 20 to 20 basis. So if you had a very good experience yesterday, the pondering would be at 20 points added to it. Then we will go to the 5 well-being dominions. And in order to understand this, we have to compare ourselves to other models. Depending on where the model is being developed, you can have additional dominions. We, however, have discovered that these 5 dominions truly express variability, or the highest degree of variability worldwide. So this is this is a global focus, if you will. So these dominions are for the proposal or the end purpose. That includes feeling good about what you do on a daily basis and motivated enough to achieve your goals. And it's connected to people when they are at the workplace, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. A housewife can feel very good, and she can have a great aim in life or a purpose of life. Then we have the social well-being, which is defined as having love, friends, and social relationships and healthy relationships. Then the financial well-being or financial well-being is not the fact of being wealthy or having high incomes, but rather having covered all your financial needs, minimum needs, so that you don't have financial stress. Then we have the communitarian or community-based well-being, and that's being proud of your community, being safe, secure, feeling good about everything that surrounds you. And finally, we have the physical well-being, which includes having enough stamina or energy to pursue your activities on a daily basis and not having any pains or any type of illness for that matter. Next, I will give you concrete results on this worldwide survey, global survey based. Basically, I will talk about Mexico, and then I will move to Latin America, and the scope will be extended to the findings on a global context so that you can understand how regions can be compared with one another. Life evaluation or life assessment. In order to have a visual understanding so that we understand what the well-being is as we speak in Mexico, please look at the 2 people to your left, whether or not they have well-being, and then 2 people to your right. So it's 2 and 2. How do they look? Do they look okay? Are they doing okay? And now look at yourself. So 2 to the right, 2 to the left, and then yourself. So 5 people all in all, 2 plus yourself. And based on our global data, 2 are not happy or plentiful happy. If this was a representative sample of Mexico, those 2 people are not prospering in life. They're not going anywhere in life. This is a negative piece of data, but this room is totally opposite. This is positive people we have here. All the attendees are positive. Now, 3 out of 5 people have a level of well-being which is at a high rank. And this is not only important because of the result, but when compared to the regional average, is the highest one. throughout Latin America. It can only be compared to Brazil. It's second to Brazil. Brazil is second to Mexico, and then we have Haiti, which is always low when it comes to prosperity and development, and only 9% of the population in Haiti is prospering. Now, from a regional perspective, we notice that Latin America has satisfaction levels that are very high, and life evaluation is very high as well, as opposed to, or they can be compared to the US, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And we have talked about this. Well, we have heard about this quite intensely during these 2.5 days. Why are Mexicans so happy? Why are Latin Americans so happy? But we have had one specific panel to explain that. The key was explained during that panel. So Mexico is very close to Europe, and it twofolds the worldwide well-being level. 1 out of 4 people are prospering. 1 out of 4 is prospering. This is the progression scenario. And then we have one graph that I really like, and we notice the per capita income on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis we see progression. We have the Gallup World Report in every single bubble, and the color represents the region. For example, China is pretty huge, the population of course is huge, and blue is Asia, or tail, light blue. And then we have the, of course, life assessment and income. We have seen this before during other presentations, the connection between life assessment and income. However, please take a look at the green bubbles. All the green bubbles are in Latin America, and we have this separated area. We have Mexico and Brazil, to be more precise, are even higher on top of what the trend should be because of the well-being context. This is a paradox that has been mentioned before, and we have been observing this for a long time now. I don't want to give you any more information. I believe that you have received quite intensive information. I want to give you my perspective instead. We travel abroad. We go all the way around the world. We carry out our interviews, and we notice that we have first-hand experiences based on these interviews and the interviewees, so the respondents. So when we ask the questioners or the interviewers, for example, Ms. Monica, she's a coordinator in Latin America, and I ask her, why are Brazilians so happy and Latin Americans from an overall context? And she tells me stories that are repeated over and over. Once, for instance, she was in Mexico City, one of the poorest areas, and she interviewed a lady. She was right in the middle of the interview. The house was very simple, 4 walls, 1 roof, and that was it. Basic conditions. And the lady that was living there was a young one with 4 kids. She was a single mom with precarious life conditions. The children were their faces were not clean, and they were playing around. So she walked to the staircase, and they were finishing the interview, and the cantrell ladder showed an 8, and Monica was somehow surprised. So when the interview was over, she said, "You have given us an 8 on life assessment, and this is pretty high. What's your secret? Why are you so happy?" And the respondent said, "Well, from a humble position, it is true we don't have much. It is true that we eat on a day-to-day basis," and then she reflected on the fact that she's alive. I said, "I am alive, and I see the sunrise on a daily basis. Every day I wake up, I see my kids, and they are still playing. I can see them play. I can watch the way they play. What else can be waited from life or expected from life?" And I notice that every time I hear from these interviews, I understand resilience-based cultural concepts in Latin America, and to be more precise, in Mexico, that make these evaluations very high. I don't think this is a bias in terms of measures, because we have heard about the fact that countries cannot be compared to one another. There, of course, are cultural differences. But there are differences, there are likelihood between the Latin American citizens that pertain to the culture. And variables are also important. When one says that, or when the interview says, "I have had a very sad day," or "I'm not feeling pretty well," we say, what do you do to solve that? How do you tackle that situation? For example, in the Caribbean, one constant answer is, Well, whenever I am sad, I put on my tap shoes or my dance shoes and I go out and dance. I don't think there's a better strategy than that. And of course, it's way better than Prozac. And we see that throughout Latin America, and we see that constantly. These are qualitative stories out in the field that show genuine differences. Now let's talk about positive experiences from a different standpoint. And let's see results on a regional basis and the worldwide basis. We see better distribution here. For example, positive experiences that are not normally part of the happy index, for example, China or Thailand. And if you have visited Thailand, maybe you're not surprised by this. For example, everybody smiles there. Is the land of the 1,000 smiles. So people have positive experiences because of that cultural condition they have. Now in Latin America, we notice that numbers are pretty high, positive experiences all in all, and many countries, for example, the U.S. and other regions in the world that reflect the same. Now, on a region-to-region basis, we do see a different distribution. Latin America is above the worldwide average or media, and that means that half of the population had at least 3 positive experiences the day before the interview. This is the way this scale or rank is generated. Mexico does not have that many positive experiences on the what happened before question. What happened one day before question. Now, we have Panama, Paraguay, and Nicaragua that have very high indexes. Let's understand why this happens. This is the comparison between Latin America as a region and Mexico. As opposed to what we saw before, we will focus on positive experiences. There's a very marked difference between joy and respect in Mexico as opposed to the Latin American average. I understand the importance of this piece of data because it explains well-being. As to negative experiences, there's no surprise here. Those countries that are undergoing terrible situations, for example, the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, or Iraq, and all those countries with very negative experiences. Mr. Gerardo he's a colleague of mine, and he was mentioning something about Bush, President Bush, that was preparing himself to invade Iraq, and he didn't know what the population felt. And he said, well, there's no possibility to get there with a Gallup survey. And he said, Mr. Christian, who is the head there, said, yes, we can, and we carry out one on a yearly basis. Negative experiences is negative in that area. Year after year. However, in Europe, many countries have been affected by the economic crisis, or in Bolivia and Peru with very negative experiences are also part of the surveys. Now, this is the region comparison in Latin America. However, Latin America is above the average. I am somehow behind schedule, so let me move forward more rapidly. These are positive experiences. We need to know more in detail what we are referring to understand this graph. Mexico has the lowest number in terms of negative experiences. Positive experiences, I'm sorry. In Mexico, it's less. There's a less ranking when it comes to concern or being concerned about something or being raged or outraged or angry. However, stress is not that high. And the well-being dominions will be better understood with this map that shows the worldwide population, all those areas that have a dominating area. For example, the Americas, both North and South America, have a higher number. Of course, we have Peru, Bolivia, and we have to consider the numbers and the colors that reflect differences. Now, this is for Mexico. I would like to show the labels, but they are not on the slide. I apologize for that. Now we see details of well-being dominions in Mexico, and this is an age group. And this has really caught our attention. The elderly people have inferior well-being as opposed to those that are under 45 years of age. And that is highly noted in all the dominions, not one specific, especially the communitarian benefit or community-based well-being. Now, if you have never studied well-being, this is not surprising. Nobody likes to age. Nobody likes to get to the elderly age. And we somehow have a bias when evaluating those numbers. But this is truly surprising. This is not an expected figure. Life evaluation has a U shape in our life. So we start in a very high position from 15 to 24 years age, and when we get the 40 age, that's the crisis. It's a crisis, and then we go down again when we age. In Mexico, this is not the case. The five dominions throughout our lives is better reflected on this table or graph. So we are young, 15 to 24. Our well-being is very high. We have no worry whatsoever. Now, when we are 25 and up, of course, we have to be concerned about our life. We have to think about our families. So the well-being somehow drops, especially with regards to the financial status and the end goal of our life. When we get to the 30 to 44 is when we really hit it. We hit the floor. And we are in the 40-year-old crisis. We are at a stage where we have financial burden. We have the house, the car, the mortgage. We have to work many hours. It's the age during which we work more. And of course, we don't have time for leisure or for any pleasure. The community is something somehow forgotten as well. And finally, we will have, or at that stage is when we start with the physical conditions. When you were at the age 30, my belly popped up and I started having seizures. And well, not seizures, but I don't think I will recover from this current health status. So all those that are in that same group, be careful about that. Now, when you were at 45, is the top of it. But then those well-being status that were declining abruptly are no longer doing that. You reach a plateau. So the next age group, especially in those that have better incomes, no longer have a financial burden. So the financial status is somehow improved. The physical status is not good. Now we get to the 65 and more, or 65 plus age group. We have the financial plentifulness. We have time to devote ourselves to those situations we are interested in, for example, the economics or the community. And this is 2013 global information. This is not only Mexico. I'm sorry, this doesn't happen in Mexico. Mexico, we have a totally different scenario. We would have to consider the physical conditions, and this is Mexico's status is not similar to what I just showed. For example, we covered the positive experiences based on respect that have no relation in this arena. And for example, Mexico doesn't have this community-based well-being as a high-ranking number. And we have the end goal of life, which is low as opposed to other countries in the region, and that is especially associated with the major or the career, the profession that people pursue, especially the job.
So it is important to take into account that what world population wants, not only in Mexico but everywhere, it's a good job. There was a work that Gallup did a while ago, and the question was, what do you truly want? A real work, not a work that would make them happy, not a work that wouldn't make them work so much. No, a job that would allow them to pay for the support and that of their family and children. So this is something to take into account when we think that 30% of jobs we need for next year have not been created. These jobs will make this well-being increase. So for these kinds of jobs, the same in Mexico as in other countries, we need to trust the micro companies, medium size and small size in Mexico and Spain and many countries. In Gallup, we have worked for so many years in job creation, in cultivating, bringing to existence these small companies, micro entrepreneurs, and we have developed a tool for evaluating the entrepreneurship strengths. So we think it is very important to identify this early on, so we are able to create and provide more opportunities to these companies and micro companies that will create jobs for the future that will increase our well-being. Now, I leave you with this. If you have questions about our work, our world poll, please approach me or get in contact with Gerardo Aranda, who is Gallup's director in Mexico. Thank you, Mr. Rosell, for such an interesting contribution. We will speak by the end of this panel about this. And now let's continue with our next speaker. He is Sergio Torres Cross. Sergio Torres, he is director of the consulting firm that is called Mercer de Mexico. He is a consultant on managerial and human resources management for complex organizations. He has participated in integration processes of large companies, mostly on what refers to mergers and purchases of companies from other companies. He has specialized in Mexican and Latin American topics. He has worked for very important companies as Avon, Alfa, Banamex, Bimbo, Hewlett Packard, Monsanto, and so on. And he will speak to us about quality of life. And he proposes a question. What determines that it is better to live in a city compared to another one? So please, Sergio, go ahead. Thank you. The topic of this forum is well-being and development, and when we think about well-being and development, we have to translate this into something. Typically, we would think that if there are high levels of well-being in cities is where we are developing, this is something we need to translate into quality of life. So thinking this from the Gallup standpoint, we would think that Germans, Swiss, Austrians, who have less happiness than us, they are offered to come to a place, such a happy place like Mexico. And in the previous presentation, we heard that living by the sea is greater. They could be sent to live by Culiacan because either Germany or Austrian or Swiss companies would love to come to Culiacan, and they are going to be very happy because they are going to come to live in a extremely happy country. But business people don't think the same when they are going to be transferred to Iraq or to Haiti, or a Mexican when they are told, I'm going to send you to live to Caracas. They are not as excited when they hear San Diego or Miami. So what determines that we have such big differences among cities, among countries, and what would Mercer do, or why is it that Mercer is hired to consult companies on these topics? As you saw, when you heard what kind of companies we work with, different from making great studies at global level for to be known by the large public. No, we do this to companies, and companies request these services because companies that work with consumption goods, sometimes they need to move executives from one place to another, and they need to see what cost of life there is if they're going to move somebody to an expensive country or a less expensive country, or it might be that it costs the same but the quality of life is not the same. So when employees think about quality of life, they need to think the same as companies, how to define quality of life. And also these studies are used later on when municipalities and states and countries intend to attract private investments to their municipalities or states or countries, and they have to compete for that. So when we have to think like in technological clusters as Guadalajara's, where we have companies like Hewlett Packard, or we think about Querétaro, and then we think about aerospace industry and why so many companies are going to Querétaro to set these aerospace companies. If quality of life in Querétaro was terrible and there was not talent that would fill the positions of these companies, why would they come to Querétaro? So we have to match words I mean, people and companies here, because we might be incredibly happy country. We might have levels of joy very high, but money, sometimes when we have seen here that money, when it lacks, things can turn difficult without money. It is not, and we can resume this. Money is not the exclusive way to obtain happiness. So the studies on quality of life that Mercer's perform are going to do this, but what we don't have the 98% of population. Gallup does that because with statistical significance, they represent societies as a whole. But for us, we have employees moving from one place to another that judge differences of living in one city or another. And this doesn't mean how many people are from Guadalajara, just to see if I'm going to get into trouble if I speak badly about Guadalajara. No, I'm just kidding. Where is the door? So it is not about what people think when we talk about Guadalajara. That's the perception of somebody who comes to live to Guadalajara about quality of life when they come to live for a while in Guadalajara. And happiness is very important. I don't see any foreigner people who say, oh, people in Mexico are horrible, they treat us very bad, they are not hospitable. No, Mexicans are very open to foreign people. We are so warm, and this generates goodwill, what they call goodwill, when they are going to bring foreign investments. And it is different when we go to Paris. Parisians are a little harsh to foreigners, especially if they speak English. So let's see what we measure when we want to know about quality of life. And we set this in order because we asked how important it is. This is for you. Think about yourselves. What do we complain about, we Mexicans in Mexico? Security. When we think about moving to another place, we political environment, social environment are important. Law enforcement. Well, I'm from Mexico City. Everything that is happening in Mexico City with all the demonstrations and everything that is currently happening, it affects the quality of life for sure, and it does affect the quality of life of Mexico and life perception from Mexicans in Mexico City, the same as we read from other countries when they talk about Mexico. So number one item is security, law enforcement, state of law as a group. Number two, we are interested in being happy, as Pablo has already talked. You know, this lady they interviewed, I'm alive, my children are happy, they play, and we're talking about healthy population. And normally we think about safety, health, how we are doing in terms of health. And when we observe all this, it's not only the quality of hospitals and doctors, no, but what do we do with waste? What do we do with toxic waste matter, or what do we do with garbage, or how do we use sewage? How are utilities in regards to health, air pollution, and so on? Number three, how do I commute between one place and another? How long would it take for me to leave my house and get to my very elegant office in Santa Fe? Probably 25 kilometers might take 4 hours. There are people who need to get to the office at 9, but they leave their home at 5 in the morning because traffic is terrible. Does this affect quality of life? Yes, from foreign people and Mexican people. So number three, it is transportation and public services for commuting. And number four, consumption goods or commodities. Is it that I can get everything I need, all commodities I might need? And it is not if they are expensive or not. At the beginning, I was telling you about another study on quality of life, and it is important, but we cannot mix this study that we have that refers only to quality of life. And when people say, well, in Mexico we have not advanced in the last 30 years, and I say, well, simply in the previous session we heard, people take classes of anything, but take also, or they might take wine. But if you remember, 30 years ago, wine in Mexico was terrible. Now you might find it, although it's expensive, and you can ask how much wine is in Spain. Here, whatever good wine, it would cost three times fold in Mexico, but you find it, and that's important. So we're going to talk about commodities and their availability. And those people who have been in contact with people from Venezuela, think about this. Think about in terms of considering going to live to Caracas, and you have to compare quality of life in Caracas compared to what we are currently living in Guadalajara. So let's see the next to get to see the other factors. This over here practically represent 2/3 of a complete measurement and the weight we're going to give to this. The other six elements, they have to do with fun and leisure. See, yes, what we normally want is to have fun, to have places to go out, parks, theaters, and it called my attention last week when I was in Buenos Aires. The number of bookstores is highest in Buenos Aires compared to the whole country of Mexico. Just to have an idea about quality of life and how some people live and what we are going to think when we think about schools and education. So think about this when we are weighing this with 3% to education, and then about schools, quality of education, only 3% weight when we compare index to other countries, and the others have to do with weather, natural catastrophes, and think where you would like to live, Toronto or Guadalajara. So if you think from this perspective, although this might be based on where am I going to take my international staff, me or any Mexican can judge these same elements. So here we can see how this appears in our overview. So let's take New York. Here on the left, it is placed as 100 with 100, so or ranked at 100. We wanted to set here some cities that would allow us to get to see the highest and lowest index. Up to the right, we have Caracas with social environment and political environment, 35. If we think about economic and environment, they cannot even change currency, but that happens also in Argentina and Venezuela. So there we have scores that are truly low. Or at least in Argentina, it is expensive. They call it the blue dollar, but you can have this exchange of currency. And commodities, once again, they go very low. If we consider Mexico, Monterrey, or Guadalajara, if we consider environment in Guadalajara, they have the highest scores. Climate cannot be compared within Mexico, living in Monterrey with very extreme weather, or Mexico City in some cases. So where do we find with this screen over here the highest score on quality of life in Latin America? Buenos Aires, you have better quality of life in Buenos Aires than in Mexico City. They have economic problems, but it's temporary. And I was there last week, and I asked him, "What crisis you're telling me about? Restaurants are full, people look happy," and yes, of course, they have these economic problems that don't help the country, but internally they don't have a bad situation as it seems from outside. So Buenos Aires is the city with the highest quality of life, Santiago de Chile, and then we in Mexico have together at the same score Monterrey, then Guadalajara, a higher quality of life than Mexico City and Sao Paulo, and then Bogota. And the lowest in Latin America would be specifically Haiti, that is a truly terrible level of life. Of course, Caracas, now they are ranked very low. So now let's get to see, if we go to our next screen, where are the highest scores globally. Vienna consistently is number one. If you get to Vienna's airport, you will read Vienna is the highest quality of life city, and they are ranked higher than New York. There are things that cannot be higher than 100 commodities. If New York has 100, very difficult to have 105. But whatever you find in New York, you find it in Vienna. So we have three cities, Austria, Swiss, and Germany. And we're not talking about happiness. We're talking simply about the categories that I mentioned earlier, and how is it that people feel or sense would live about living in these countries, or Auckland in New Zealand, or Vancouver in Canada, compared to those low score or low ranked cities, Republic of Yemen, Chad, Haiti, Port-au-Prince, and then Central Africa, and Iraq. So when independently from measuring what refers to happiness or well-being, we need to find the link between well-being and development, and how this translates into quality of life, as it has been mentioned several times by the citizens of these different countries. So let's see how it works in Mexico with some pieces of information in order to see if this makes sense when broken down. And this is broken down in more detail. Hospital services. The fact is that Mexico City, Monterrey, and Guadalajara, we're not doing bad in terms of hospital. We might not have the same doctors. Mexican doctor or people continues to go to Houston or New York to get medical assistance. So how are we doing wrong in terms of health? Let's consider pollution of the air in Mexico City. New York is polluted is not 10, but Mexico City is 1, and below 0 is nothing. So the lowest rank is 1. So the poorest quality of air. Or either we work on addressing this. When we showed this to Mexican city authorities, we told them you need to work on potable water, wastewater. All insects die during the winter, but here we have mosquitoes, spiders, scorpions, and they are not so terrible, so that's not so much concern. But there are other topics that can concern us more, like infectious diseases. When we talk about infectious diseases, we think of pandemics. How would we manage in Mexico City Ebola cases? Ebola cases, if it comes to Mexico, would be able to contain Ebola as they do in other countries. So this is where we need to score low hospitals and medical services, which is not so different. What we do either in Monterrey, Guadalajara, and City is 6.66 or 6.5. So let's think. When we talk about policies, and this is the next, we have to talk about policies and development and well-being. What policies shall be installed so we attract more private investment companies and talents, people coming out from university, so they want to come to work in Guadalajara or to work in any other of the Mexican cities that will allow us to have larger development in our cities. So let's go to the next in order to see how this gets compared. In terms of a variety of restaurants, we are ranked low. It is clear for me. I have traveled everywhere, and in Mexico, food is excellent. The food is incredible. The best strawberry grown in Mexico goes to New York. When they ask me about the best beef, New York. The best lobster or shrimps, New York. But that doesn't mean we cannot get this in Mexico and that we don't eat well. Variety of restaurants in Mexico City is incredible. 365 different varieties of restaurants, one per day, and they don't compete. They compete with the quality of restaurants in New York, undoubtedly. And there are wonderful restaurants in other places in Latin America. Probably the only restaurant with Michelin in Latin America is based in Peru. Peruvian food is also very good, excellent. So how do we rank in terms of entertainment, theater, and music? Buenos Aires, they have more theaters than New York, actually. More bookstores than whole Mexico. And I'm just saying the city of Buenos Aires compared to the Mexican Republic. I'm talking about number of theaters, in Manhattan. There are more in Buenos Aires, so they rank very high. In terms of movie theaters, if you have gone to see a movie in the United States, well, they're so bad, but here in Mexico, movie theaters are beautiful. They are incredible in Mexico City, and we have the same kind of movie theaters in Monterrey, Guadalajara, Pachuca. So I think score in terms of movie theaters, or whoever who scored this, ranked us low. In terms of activities, entertainment activities and idle time, New York is doing better than us, but we have 8. We ranked 8. So that's why when we saw the previous scores, we can see that we are not low ranked, or why we have low ranks in terms of security. So let's go to the next one. When we get to see commodities. You can see we ranked very well. I don't know how what in Guadalajara they mean. If you need to go abroad to buy something else, no, it seems that for Mexico we have 10, 10, 10. We get everything, and it happens to me that sometimes I Google something I want to buy, and then the company is based in Guadalajara, and then, oh, can you bring it to Mexico City? There's everything in Guadalajara, and see the comparison to against New York. We don't compete in terms of price, but we have access to all these commodities. So I think this is very interesting information that helps us knowing what to do, how to do it. We saw recreation and some other categories. The thing is how to translate this. How does it translate when we talk about employees or staff? And the previous topic we saw that employees are asked, and this is very interesting. This is about quality of life, but how does it translate? And I'm going to join here elements that we saw from previous presentations, Pablo's included. Mexico is more similar to the United States than to Brazil in many aspects, but many other aspects, we are Latin Americans, so we are very similar to Brazil. So this survey is not only for companies on what they do with their employees, but employees, what they do and how do they see this. And I will tell about elements that have to do with generations. In the previous panel, somebody talked about how happy employees are in their companies, and we have a survey in Mercer that is called Inside Employees' Mind, what employees have in their heads, what they have, and the younger they are very, very happy in the company they work at. If they would recommend this to a friend, but they want to leave the company, so that doesn't match. They recommend this to a company. You come here to work in this company, but I'm leaving. Well, maybe that's not his best friend. So what do we value in Latin America? If we see Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, what they consider is development potential, career. Where do I grow? Those are the yellow. The yellow, Brazil, Argentina is number 2, and Mexico, where we are very similar to Canada and the U.S. The thing we're most interested is a base salary. Yes, we're interested in base salary, but when we refer to development, then we can compare strongly with Argentina and Brazil, where the only switch here is in terms of number. Gray to Canada and the US, they don't have saving plans. We don't have that. We don't have that at all in Latin America. And it is very funny when we broke down this, even more Mexicans think that their bosses are doing enough, making enough money, so they retire, they live as if they were rich. So we have these contrasts, and this take us to think within the context. When we talk about quality of life, it's not only quality of life in the city, but how does this translate in terms of employment, and what do people search for, and what things need to be done by the companies. Of course, they have to pay well, but what other elements must be added so employees continue to feel happy on what they are doing, the kind of job, medical insurance, other elements that intervene the quality of life of employees. Then with this I finish. I'm sure there's going to be many other elements and questions that we can talk about this later, and I thank you for your time. Thank you, Sergio. Next, we are going to ask Francisco Abundis to take the floor. And prior, I will allow myself to introduce him to you. He has a PhD in political science from Connecticut University, specializing in social psychology and quantitative methods. He has also done research at Oxford University, where he has a master's degree from public policy sciences, and in Columbia University he has a master's degree from international affairs. And in Michigan he studied quantitative interpretation, and at the University of California he has a diploma course on the political system of the United States. He is associate director of the company that is called Parametria, and his main line of research are social psychology, public opinion, and electoral behavior. So Francisco has been a professor and researcher at CIDE. He has been guest professor at ITAM and professor of the Iberoamericana University. He has performed as consultant to the federal government, other local governments, political parties, and international organizations. The topic that he will approach next is, what do Mexicans say about their own well-being? Please, Francisco. Good day. Thank you. First, I want to thank the organizers. This seems to me a visionary event linking together these public policies to well-being follows the trend we are seeing in other countries in the world. And I have to say that coming from the consultant side, when we perform surveys on perception linked to public policies, gives us the opportunity to get to see very specific examples from different places inside Mexico, outside Mexico also, and we can have a vision, a more general vision with similar studies as Pablo showed us. And there is a study that I will show you. It is from an ex-director of Gallup. He's working on a NGO that is most relevant to the world now as a non-government organization, the Pew Research. He's the director. He was formerly working at Gallup, and some data I will present to you will be similar to that Pablo presented. But I would like to start my presentation by warning you. I'm sorry. Frequently at this kind of debate, when comparing countries' differences and explaining phenomena, the first question that comes to our mind is if the difference between one country and another is based on features intrinsic to that country, as it might be their culture or some regional phenomenon, or could we argue from the methodological standpoint? Could we discuss this from the methodological standpoint? And I would like to talk about Mexico in these previous presentations or previous events where we present this kind of information, either in Mexico or elsewhere in international conference. This comes to attention, and I will give you 2 or 3 examples. Nowadays, when we present data on how economic expectation is in Mexico, how it was assessed in the past and how it is assessed for the future, we have 4 basic matrix. We have the sociotropic retrospective evaluation, how we saw the country, how we see our country in the past; prospective, what do we think about its future; personal, about the past; personal, about the future. And this gives us a combination of variables that sometimes explains satisfaction with authorities, levels of approval, and also electoral preference sometimes. And now, due to what we are talking about today, we have measurements that are very intensive, very accurate, very frequently done on regards to security. In parametria, we started a series when before Peña's administration with Calderón. It started as a federal measurement, but then it became specialized to measure security based on all the problems we currently undergo in Mexico. I have the privilege to be working for 25 years in this public area with public opinion and electoral affairs. I can give you a piece of information that to me seems very characteristic of what we are undergoing. I think I never saw in the country so many social and political microclimates with differences in the mood that are so big. If you have been in Jalisco or Nuevo León, or if you live by the central Mexico, the Bajío, or southeast in Yucatan, or South Baja California before the hurricane, they just had things that are happening now in Guerrero, Tamaulipas, or Michoacán. the citizens now see this from a distance, as if these citizens living in these specific places where there's prosperity and optimism, and I don't this from my perception. We have data. These some spaces are growing at 5%, 6%, but it is not for the whole country. Only half the country is growing positively.
The rest of the country has negative growth percentages, and we have an expectation that is based on an average of those states that are actually growing, but it's the average, including those that are not growing. So if we were to include also this insecurity, we would have microclimates, many microclimates, and depending on where the citizen lives, he or she will not have a clear idea what the public policies are. And I do not recall a situation like the current one, at least in the past 25 years. Let's say that you live in Yucatan, in the peninsula, and you don't want to see that the state of Guerrero is part of your city, or you never believe that that could happen in your entity. And well, we work on qualitative studies that lead us to reflect on this. In English, we will have the denial concept. There's certain denial. If I live in the city of Querétaro, I want to continue to live in the city of Querétaro, and I don't want to consider Guerrero as Mexico. And unfortunately, the fact is that Guerrero is one of our 32 states. In addition to that, we also have a situation with other variables. For example, economy and security are going to be more detailed later on during my presentation. But let's talk about now approval, the level of approval to the entities or officials, to the government. We can give 30, 35, 40, but in this country, we have never seen numbers below 30. In the history of Mexico, if I were to tell you about France and Spain, well, France's government is not doing that well. They have 13, 15% in terms of approval. Or Peru with Alan Garcia, or with Mr. Toledo, 9%, or Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, 40%, or Obama. So all those countries could serve as a baseline in order to compare Mexico and how we are doing, for comparison purposes alone. But we have to understand that those citizens are really criticizing the governments. Why isn't that the case here in Mexico? We will have up-Nixon numbers. Up-Nixon number is a reference name that we give to those percentages below 28. Here in Mexico, we don't criticize. Here in Mexico, we have a negative perception of economy, on a very low perception of safety or the overall security, but the authorities' approval turns out to be high, or similar to those places where we have no conditions similar to those. Now, we could have anthropological observation, ethnographic observation, but at the end of the day, a great part of our measures are based upon what people tell us. And if I turn this to the political context, very recently we had a crisis, a scandal. During the presidential election, well, the previous presidential election, there was very harsh criticism for the overrating of the current president. So there was no accuracy in the results, but number one, number two, and number three are the numbers that we ended up with, and those numbers are not very accurate. So we have to hear what people say, then we interpret what they are telling us, but that's a constraint. We should consider that as a constraint. The difference between what people tell us and what we interpret from these statements. Then we have two basic dimensions for the well-being. One is an objective one, data similar to what I mentioned before, for example, economic growth or income, having a job or being unemployed, and the subjective one, which is the perception, how we perceive things around us. The objective includes estimates, with which we work on a daily basis. These are numbers we constantly use, for example, the International Bank, the World Bank, or numbers that relate to the region or to other countries or to our own country. This objective includes many studies that have been mentioned before. We have to understand what the correlation index is, how we can compare one with the others. Most of this data, of course, I will not overwhelm the audience with all this information, but apparently a great deal of the most developed economies have growth percentages or growth rates that truly are below other countries. For comparison, we have $40,000, $50,000 on a yearly basis, which go way beyond the limits in Latin America. We are somewhere around 10 and 15,000 on a monthly basis, monthly salaries. There is now, if we were to compare 7 years worth of data since the year 2007 all the way to 2014, and the Pew Research Center just issued this type of information, October 2014, and I recommend that you have access to this information. And well, we have life improvement. Well, we could translate that as happiness into Spanish, but if we analyze this 7-year rank or 7-year range, I would then understand that advanced economies can undergo a crisis, for example, from 57 to 54, and that's a grade, not so much a percentage. Then we have developed countries in the lower bottom line. So this is precisely where we move into the emerging markets. If we do this on a country-to-country basis, and this data is very similar to what Pablo presented, we see advanced countries, and Israel in that case presents itself with higher well-being levels, and then the US, and the third being Germany and the UK. Now, Spain is pretty interesting because this is the only economy that has shown the most serious economic conditions or that have a negative influence on the citizens. But the second line, or the second group rather, is the emerging countries. And we should ask ourselves why Mexico or Venezuela, for that matter, are there. Somebody mentioned Caracas a couple of minutes ago. One of the previous speakers mentioned Caracas, and that city has the highest criminal rate, more homicides, 122, going beyond San Pedro Sula and Nicaragua, and most of the cities in the region, and Caracas alone. Then we would have Brazil, then we would have Argentina, and countries below those lines, some in the Eastern European sector, and the Middle East is also included here. This slide refers to the Happy Planet Index. We have heard this information before. I will not elaborate on that. Now, in Mexico, we have a more sophisticated debate, and I congratulate myself for having INEGI, which recently joined the group of the selected survey and information high status. This is high-end information we are referring to, and the way they carry out their studies. Now, the next slide. How? From 0 to 10. 0 means unsatisfied, and 10 is satisfied. The question is how satisfied you are. Well, 47% reflects satisfaction. Moderately satisfied, 47%. This is derived from the INEGI, the Bureau of Geography and Statistics, but our numbers are pretty similar. One first question would be the following. We have category-based variables. We should ask what's happening to Mexico. This is the Mexican uniqueness. Why are we different from other countries when responding to this type of questions? I relate this to the problem I first quoted. Apparently, here in Mexico, it's very hard for us to fail others. Not fail ourselves, but fail others, or criticize others. And our scale, which is part of articles and papers that have been presented way, because this is one of the many organizations that work on opinion polls. Well, apparently our mental scale is somewhere between 5 and 10 regularly. And if we have a 5, 0 to 5, it's complicated, or 0 to 7, it's even more complicated. So some of these categories we use departed from information at Imagina, and depending on the color, we have the level of satisfaction, which is extremely unsatisfied to extremely satisfied. These are not symmetrical, but it serves pretty well. It works pretty well for the objective of this study. Now, the northern region of Mexico is in green, and the most critical states would be in red. But this scale, which is the bar to the right, would tell that here in Mexico, it's very complicated for us to fail or to flunk others. So below 5, what would he or she think about me? And we are concerned about that. So there's a whole topic about that. What is happening with the scales or the ranking scenes here in Mexico? What's happening with that? What about that? During our review, we worked on 2 models that reproduce this information. The Pew Research for Mexico has a model number 1, which includes socio-demographic factors, for example, gender, education level, age, incomes, and marital status, as well as the occupational status. And model 2, which is more complicated, has to do with life dimensions deriving or originating from public policies. We have to focus on other topics. We have to include insecurity and income. Next slide. The results based on the Pew research include income as a relevant variable. It's obvious. However, other contextual elements are significant when applied in other countries. This includes 43 countries, but these are not applicable to Mexico. And here's what I find interesting. Age is an important matter, and I will move to the graphs. From the demographics, we understand that for a great part of the country, with 43 countries that will be shown in the next slide, and you have the advanced countries, developed countries, and developing countries are all included here. So we have assets, or asset possession would be very important when it comes to demographics. That includes income or educational level and being a woman. So being a woman alone represents more well-being, also being employed and being married. Out of these variables, the only one that is significant is income. It's the only one that is applicable. It's red. It's the red block we see on the graph below. I do hope that you could observe this more in detail, but it's very similar to what Pablo showed, not because of the country dimension, but furthermore the income in comparison to the well-being, and the highest positioned dot to the left is Mexico. And in statistics, this would be an outlier. In Spanish, we don't like the translation, but it's called aberrant. It's an aberrant number. That's what statisticians use. And Mexico is an outlier. It's an aberrant number. And we have more questions to ask when we see this type of graph. More questions than answers. When we see income per se, we notice the green bars, that if we had a linear correlation, the curve on top of these bars would indicate that the higher the income, the higher the well-being. However, the curve drops with all the stratum that have a higher income. So theoretically speaking, that shares the fact that we have decreasing growth after certain levels of income, and that is also applicable to other countries. That also suitable to many other countries. This is the age curve that Pablo very well explained before. We are going down here. Now we have the 30s, the 40s, and then the 50s. When you reach the 50s, and right there you can once again recuperate your or recover the initial status of well-being when it comes to the financial parameter. Now, from a contextual perspective, we include data during the last minute of my presentation. Let me tell you very briefly that life standard turns out to be the most important one for these 43 countries. That is not as wide as Gallup's measure. they cover 85% of the population, and the fact of having a job or family life, social life, as well as health. It turns out that in Mexico, in the case of Mexico, it is obvious that safety, which is not here, is the most important one, or overall security is fundamental for the country. It does not apply in other countries. And this originates from a model that relates to where you are living. So there's a country perception, a state, a city, a community perception. But the most important relevant one is I know what's happening in my neighborhood. I don't know what's happening in the state. I don't know what is happening in the rest of the country, but I do know what's happening in my furrow or in my borough or in my neighborhood, my sector. So the country is a perception that is quite unusual when having a model of this kind. Another variable that is intensely mentioned is health. But when we talk about the first comment, well, that's pretty common to the rest of the world. The other two are not. The other two are not suitable. This is the Mexico uniqueness once again, or what makes us different. Finally, next slide. This is a concern and a questioning for methodological purposes. And in order to understand that, we have created this map, and it has to do with victimization or security levels. And we have victimization rates as reported, yellow being less, for affecting 40% of the population having reported being victimized. Then red is 61 and plus, and orange is 50. The black spots or the black dots include hard data that are very similar to perception. And that means that the rest of the states that have no black dot, there's an overrating or underrating security as opposed to hard data. Let me put up a warning in the air. And when we talk about a general pattern or a unique pattern, we have to understand the difference, and perceptions can lead to a delicate issue. We have insecurity, and we have to be concerned about that, and we have to analyze it from that standpoint. Thank you very much. We would like to thank Mr. Francisco Abundis for his very interesting presentation. And next, I am honored to introduce Mr. Pablo Parás Garcia. He has a master's in political science by the Connecticut University. He's also a professor and scholar of Latin American Studies by Georgetown University. He's a chairman and founder of Data Public Opinion and Market. And since 1997 and all the way through 2003, he performed as director of public opinion centers. He's associate researchers for Mexico for the America's Barometer and or America's Gauge, and also public opinion gauge. Also the Citizenship Observatory, Jalisco Como Vamos, Jalisco How We Are Doing, and he's also part of the All Against Corruption and Good Government, Good Governance. He was a representative of the Este País, or this country, before the technical committee, the ICESI in Mexico City. He's representative in the country before the WERPORT, the Public Opinion World Reference, and also part of the Latin American Bank. Professor Pablo will talk about the subjective calibration. How do we measure and calibrate well-being from a subjective standpoint, and how do we measure that? Thank you for that. Most of the measures based on civic society use questions with a yes or a no. Do you justify the fact that people um, don't pay taxes, or if you are in a queue, they just stand in front of you and don't respect the others, and that sort of question? Well, here in Mexico, almost 85% of these questions or reactives are non-tolerable. They are never justified. They are never justified. So we are happier than others, but we are also more civilians or civilized. Now, in 1968, there was a study, a comparative research that included 3 countries with an alternative question. And it stated, how smart do you consider people that stop paying taxes, or that pay fines, or that bribe others, or that they do not respect the queues, or people that are waiting in line? And almost half of Mexicans interviewed admire or consider these people smart. So, in the best case scenario, we have a disassociation and low correspondence between the metrics. And in the worst case scenario, there's schizophrenia. So, we admire everything that we don't tolerate or put up with. So, this is a contradiction. So, you might now understand what I am referring to. I am not an expert on happiness. I have been working on public opinion measurements for the past 25 years, and from that stance, let me tell you that I don't think that Mexicans can have a better measure. Of course, I understand that Mexicans are happy. It's not the fact here, but we can better calibrate the transcendence of this important phenomenon. Let's do it in an accurate way, and let's adjust our tools or measuring tools whenever required. This is a brief historical background described during these 6 items. We will talk about the power of perceptions, the construction of a discourse, the context and paradox of happiness in Mexico, the validity and reliability minimums as a social capital, and we will talk about the objective and subjective. It's always required to put things into concept. We understand the power of perceptions, and this model explains why. We, as individuals, are exposed to information, which is item number 1, and then we have a context. We'll, of course, go through experiences, but this has the individual filter, the screen, if you will. And those perceptions will turn into attitudes, and attitudes have 3 components: the affective one, the cognition, and behavior. So affection, cognition, and behavior. And this is a virtuous cycle. There's reciprocity. So once we have created an attitude, of course, we interpret the context based on said attitudes. So public opinion surveys add up opinions from a group, but we need to consider how they received information, and we also have to include how they interpret this information. Hence, the subjective has to be measured in a very accurate way. I will show information based on Ipsos recently with interesting outcomes. This is the ignorance being analyzed. So how much do we know, and to what extent that corresponds to reality? Here we are presenting the population with different country scenarios, and they are all considered to be migrants. So we have 23 points, and well, apparently there's migration as part of the debate. So we overestimate this type of topic in all the countries. The same thing happens with Muslims. Muslims is a worldwide phenomena, is a discourse or a debate that has a greater distortion when it comes to reality. France, 23 points. The truth of the matter is that only 8% is the persistent number, but French believe that 1/3 of the population is Muslims, or comprised of Muslims. So this is a discourse that has been created upon perception. Last week we had this very interesting report by Andrea Sherlin, and I do believe that narco guerra, or the drug dealer war, was broken as part of the debate. So many years we heard that the bad guys were fighting against the bad guys. Now we have an event like the recent 43 abducted and disappeared students, and we now have a war amongst criminals. So Mexico has moved, as Andreas said, from indignation the to a position that cannot tolerate what happens. This is the fragility of the discourse whenever the population imaginarium includes this type of information or knowledge. I believe that here in Mexico, to a certain extent, we have a well constructed happiness discourse. This is a Facebook post, and the person says, we have everything despite the fact that we have politicians and entrepreneurs, monopolies, and mobsters. But despite it all, we continue with the country. We play click. Maybe you have watched this video. This is a beautiful video. We have this typical customs, and then we have the culture, the tradition, the food, and we need to be proud whenever watching this video to be Mexican. So apparently this is a contrast, the schizophrenia, as I mentioned before, but we start to solve this, so sort it out with more accurate and precise measures. We have heard about the word of the word paradox several times. The paradox that is still persisting in Mexico. I would like to zoom in on this information. This is Jalisco, ¿cómo vamos? Jalisco, how are we doing? This is a comprehensive, thorough review with the proposal of 3 dimensions. Well, it was not a proposal. It was 3 dimensions as part of the baseline. We have the urban context, the constitutional context, and the society. So from within this group we identified 15 components, and from those 15 components we work on separate measures with 3 or more reagents, in this case reactives or questions for this questionnaire. So we could analyze this from a question perspective or from a component perspective. Don't move forward yet. I want to still elaborate this slide, please. Now, if you have a statistical model, you could understand life quality in Jalisco, which is at 56.5%, so that we can place it in a 0 to 100 scale. This is 212, 213 with very little variation, but quality-wise, the glass is half filled, half empty, and the information in this type of survey is of utmost importance for all those that make decisions, that the policymakers, given that this is a very extensive menu to understand where we can improve. This is a type of tools or instruments we should replicate, especially when we are measuring objectives. These are results based on the survey, one of the many surveys that was mentioned in previous talks. Now, from 0 to 10, and as Francisco stated during his talk, has a positive bias above 5, and most of the answers are concentrated on the higher percentages. So during René Millán's presentation, he showed regressions, and there were 2 groups. I think it was 9, 10, and the rest. 9, somewhere between 9 and 10, and the rest. We should work on a scale that could give us better responses, so that we can work on better statistical models and better understanding of the outcome. I do believe that's possible. We need to work on that type of scale. Now, when we talk about minimum numbers, we refer to validity. Any phenomenon that cannot be observed closely has to be measured by multiple indicators. We cannot, by definition or by default, observe something we cannot view with one question, or something we cannot observe. And that speaks a lot about indicators of this very important area of knowledge. Now, once we have indicators, we need to work on a factorial program or study, so that we can understand that it belongs to the same cohort. And during this past 2 days and a half, I have heard so much theory, so that this can have a value correlated with all the other factors I now know. I now know. Another example so that you can notice how easily we can make mistakes. This is for human capital. This is a survey. So I will try to understand human capital based upon how much people speak, to what extent people speak English, and to what extent they are able or skillful to use computers and technological tools. This is for the Mexican population. The first question being, do you speak or do you understand English? And the ones that said no would have follow up. For example, can you read or can you at least understand some English? This is the distribution. 65% said no, 23% said yes, and 12% said yes, a little bit. And 4 regions of the country were part of this survey. Now, for this specific question, which state had the best, or which region had the best result? The southeastern part of the country. When I gave these results to my client, he said, this is wrong. There's something wrong, especially on top of the northern region. And I insisted that it would be interesting to repeat the questions applied to the northern region, but he would have to pay twofold if I was wrong. If I was right, and I would have to give him this report for free if he was right. Of course, we had the same results over and over. Now, the southeast, or the southern eastern part of Mexico, and this is just a hypothesis. Of course, I speak English, and of course, I help the tourists. And the people in the north, no, I don't. My friend, my cousin, my relative speaks English. I don't. So interpretation is different. Now, it was interesting to see how we could complement this information. We had 21 questions organized within the knowledge scheme. Simple questions. If you go to a restaurant, can you ask for something in the menu in English? Can you watch a movie in English, or at least understand? In the southeastern, they had the worst skill-based capacity on the English language. So we have to evaluate the subjectiveness. Otherwise, we would generate wrongful or erroneous mistaken information, and that has a very high risk. Then we have social capital.
I think this has to do a lot with subjective well-being, from what I understand, and the origin is not so clear. Definitions are truly general and difficult to operate, but it becomes very, very appealing when Putnam comes with this book, Voting Alone. But at the origin, measurements are very low quality, and I will give you an example. And then these poor measurements get linked to experiments that are linked to all kinds of establishments or characteristics. And then they get to social capital, where they establish both two notions, cognitive and structural, with 3 components: confidence, or engagement, and reciprocity. Each one of them are very difficult to measure. Imagine trust, institutional trust, interpersonal trust, and for each of them we need, because they depend in the subjective, and I cannot observe this directly. There are measurements through several items, and at least we finally get robust measurements, but I am not so certain if this reduced relevance. I think human capital was sexy, and then social capital was sexy. Now it seems to be that the sexiest thing is subjective well-being. You are at the right place at the right moment. Congratulations. And this is one of the questions that most damaged social capital in the world. It was the original question about generalized confidence, and they include this in the world of values, and everybody replicated this. And there were only 2 options. Could we trust most of the people, or you can never be too careful? And this is the distribution for the year 2000 in Mexico. Mexico is a country that totally lacks confidence. This is blank, all blank. By definition, trust is not something general. It depends on situation and a specific context. I trust her, or I trust him, or I trust this institution or this other, but there's no general context. And when we measured confidence or trust, the previous one, Oh no. Oh, it isn't there. So there are four questions in regards to how much do you trust your relatives or your family members? How much do you trust your neighbors? And then you get a totally different picture. Mexicans have very, very healthy levels of social capital and they trust enough. And mostly on their closest circles, their families. And causality. Cosali, I'm a little confused after having attending this forum, and I don't know if subjective well-being or if it is satisfaction with life or quality of life, and then I get to see causal models, and of course the objective causes the subjective, and there has to be correspondence with income and satisfaction, but everything we measure by subjective well-being says it is not true. So I think it is important that based on hard data as good as René Millán's what he presented, we need to make additional analysis in order to get to see if there is causality and if there is correspondence or they correlate, and then get to see if we can generate better indicators. And lastly, I have two slides. I think there's two still, and I think that there are general determinants for subjective well-being, and they have been addressed already. And I think we need to get back to culture and go to the Cultural Change Institute. As they say, Latin American countries, we have these contemplative cultures based on Catholicism, and this makes that our interpretations in this sense about happiness are under a somehow different scope. We have to consider the culture and the context. Francisco has told us about this uncertainty in terms of security that we are living. Now in Mexico, the rate of non-response is increasing when we survey. It is probably that only the happiest people answer the service. So we have stopped getting to many places in Mexico due to lack of security. So we might be biased positively because we only get to the places where our workers get to work safely. And the structure and has to be also measured. I was in China a while ago. China is undergoing impressive changes at impressive speed. The dimension we cannot imagine, like for example, policy, the one-child policy, a new social class that has surplus to invest, and they can only invest in China, bringing women to labor force, and not only to labor force but the society. And it is having a daughter is no longer dishonor as it was earlier on. And we need to consider the context we are making research on these kind of processes. We have talked about family. Family is wonderful in Mexico, but it is changing and changing quickly. And this is going to lead to consequences in our filter, our perception, our attitude, and this of course is going to affect the rate of happiness and subjective well-being we have here. And also how much of this is only discourse, and if it is only discourse, how fragile it is. And the list young people here, genetically we were born against a re-election and against a Pemex privatization. This was part of our genetics, and political cost measured by the service. Nobody would dare to have the reforms we just had. So that's why they had to match consensus, because everybody would have to pay for it. And today we are envisioning the possibility of re-election and the possibility of open ourselves to some other issues. But we need to consider the discourse, and it has to be relevant, at least in some aspects. And the next one. And this is a chart that I found, and I will tell you briefly about it in order to link government and well-being. The question says, does government more than individuals is the main responsible to make sure that people have well-being In Latin America, we Latin Americans expect the government to produce our well-being. Mexico is ranked by the middle, but it's very high percentage about this in Latin America. And finally, what's next? To know about the mood, it is relevant but not enough. I think this is relevant for public policies, but we should not fall in the trap of accountability or responsibility. A government that feels at ease because of these numbers. Let's prevent and avoid mistakes in our measurements. Let's have a dialogue amongst collaborators. I learned psychology and communication, so the way I build questionnaires is different from a politologist. So we need to establish a dialogue among colleagues, and we need to study and do more research about these very important topics. Most of the investment and public opinion go to electoral or to links between governments and people. This is important, but we need to push this agenda for in order to have more studies of this kind. Thank you. Thank you, Pablo. And now to finish with this panel, we are going to introduce to you our fifth speaker. It is Mr. Cordova Martinez. He is a researcher on urban subjects. He's currently working at Bogota as in the legacy of trust. He has been consultant in the planning ministry of Colombia. He has been advisor, and he has been the director of the mayor's office in Bogota. He is the former director of Bogota Como Vamos, how are we doing? And he is the manager for contracts and for the plan of strategic planning at Colombia. He was majored as a in public management, a specialist in public management, and he has been professor. He has a master's degree in philosophy. So please, Carlos Cordova. I want to repeat to everybody, to the government of this state for having invited me to come here to present. I will try to be brief in this presentation. There are many things that I was planning to say but have been presented already. I will talk about five things from 1 to 4. I will try to go faster so I can talk more about examples when measuring perception in Colombia through this Colombian network, and I will tell you about this later on. But the first thing I want to tell you is that I'm very impressed from the level, from the bulk of studies about subjective happiness and subjective well-being that I have been able to hear and to listen to in this event, because from where I come from, this is still a little metaphysical. In Colombia, when we talk about surveys on happiness and when we get to see we are very highly ranked, people laugh. People say, they mock about it. What is that? And it happens also in the Andean countries. I wouldn't dare to say that in general for the whole countries of South America, but the countries nearby, the level of discussion I have heard here about the seriousness on studies on subjective well-being, we don't have yet. So at this initial stage of my presentation, I want to tell you about some concepts, and I will go truly fast. So basically, how much these perception studies are telling us in order to have better public policies, and how much governments are listening about this, because I have heard of so many studies reviewed by so many academic institutions, signed, but there is the question always emerging: where are governments gathering all these results? How do they translate this into public policies? I think we are slower in that sense, and that's normal. It's normal. Of course, not all governments are going to run to get these survey results in order to change public policies, but there are also critical positions, and these positions, I think, in general, I think that public policy should be ensembled on information. And it is important to say, although it is obvious, because we have rulers who only set public policies based on their intuition, but when they are armed with information, the trend continues to be based on hard data. Perception, as I said, for Colombia and other nearby countries, is still delayed. It's still delayed in order to. It is difficult to influence those policymakers. Earlier, we heard that if Aristotle had been born in this era, he would have studied. Aerospace engineering, but I should say then that if Descartes or Marx would have been born, they probably wouldn't lead a public opinion institute. So we still have some technocracies that are very Cartesian when assembling public policies that are based on hard data, that are filtered by reasoning, by relying on proof. And this is from Descartes. Descartes, when he settled the modernity of science, he gave us something which is wrong, and that's because he got rid of sensations and personal or body feelings. Only that which goes through the method of reasoning serves, because any sensation or feeling or our own senses trick us, or deceive us. And allow me to please forgive me for making this philosophical expression, and then we take this into consideration from the dialectic standpoint. These are concrete expressions that set our reality, and opinion is constricted. So this is not, opinions are not very reliable. People should be mobilized instead of filling out questionnaires. So this is the way we have worked in terms of public policy. And there is an imbalance, still an imbalance when formulating public policies. We continue to set emphasis on hard data more than reports on perception and subjective information. Of course, we have this challenge ahead. Now we are going to need to use this information, the one that we have heard during these 3 days, so we can accommodate this to our public policies or to the public policy making. And I think we need to acknowledge some thinkers and philosophers that endeavor their work to recuperate senses and feelings that broke Cartesian, as Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, Gadamer, who said, let's wait a second. Reason is fine, but here we have the senses, and the senses provide information, and senses build a way to understand the world. Walter Benjamin's work on the city, they recount a different resolution that goes beyond reason. And of course, for economy and public policies, the very recent, and I'm talking about the last 30 years, recent in history's time, with psychology studies and all its variations about informal institutions and the science of happiness, have contributed with a lot. And the importance with the mass media, the importance of mass media regarding public opinion. So I find that when we try to sell the citizen's voice, when trying to sell the results of public opinion, there are three criticisms, or three elements of criticism, and I will try to see how this can be addressed when we value public opinion. People think, or they say, people don't tend to think. They are easy. They can be easily influenciated, and this is not hard data. And people used to hear to all these words and they trust and they believe, or maybe because they heard something they say the mayor is not as good, or they are not satisfied with how mobility is managed. There is a very long discussion. The director of statistics told us about an art book of 150 years ago, but Padua in the 14th century was saying never ask the people. They are like donkeys, don't ask them. And I remember they said in this case, now it is said that now we need the people's voice in order to build our public policy. So I think it is very important to sell results in perception, about perception studies or from perception studies. And when I talk about this, with all these presentations I've heard, hopefully we would have a mayor to be seated here for 3 days to know that there's lots of science behind. And it is not only the radio broadcast that asks in the morning if people think their city is safe. So what do we understand by perception? It is important to define. And also perception is different from reality, and this is the position that many public policy makers have. They say this is reality and perception is something different. So we can come from many areas to this or criticize this. There is a very good example from Hilary Putnam, the analytical philosopher, that says you place brains in a bucket. Probably some very bad scientific has set some brains in the bucket, and we are probably in that bucket, and we have been programmed for these 3 days to come and sit down and discuss about perception. So what's reality, what's not reality? That's something that I think we have enough analysis that has proved that perception is reality, and studies on anthropology, urban anthropology, on how people feel their cities. And you can know about imagined cities. There are 25 imagined cities where they have studied what's the most dangerous place in the city, what does the city smell like, where people meet together in that city, a kind of elements that proves that's people's reality, or at least for the people that inhabit that city or those cities. So in general, when we gather information from these studies that it was proposed earlier on, we know there is time and a space where perception is really much more reliable than objective data, optimization data. For example, for anyone who's going to have information for making policies, they will see that victimization studies are more reliable than reviewing the police management denounces. Because if you ask somebody, have you been victim to a crime, and they ask, did you denounce this? More than 50% don't go to denounce. So administration or official records from the police are not as reliable. And the second criticism is that people are never satisfied. So these perception surveys, they only gather information that is not useful because people are never satisfied. Well, what a conclusion. If they are not satisfied, if Carlos Slim is not satisfied, well, the common citizen is not satisfied. But what happens here is that the perception is not gathered only from citizens to know if they are fully satisfied. We know this won't happen from the Maslow's pyramid, from all the data we have gotten to see. But perception survey, at least in terms of public urban topics, public discussion, they allow us to define the preference of citizenship. No hard data can provide this information, and then this allows that levels of unsatisfaction can be classified, taking safety and security as a core. There are 1,000 ways of reading victimization data that will allow us to know if this is by territories, by time during the day, by kind of people, the kind of decisions that could be made in terms of public policy. policies. And this perception data allows us to prioritize, to identify specific territories or groups that could be assisted in a better manner when we have this information and we not only rely on hard data. There are three things that perception surveys gather, and that they are difficult to find elsewhere. Perception about people, expectations, what people want to do, what path that they want to follow, and proposals as well. It is so complicated to sell governments and this, but this seems so interesting to me, and I will give you some examples. So anyhow, there are risks, and the recommendation would be not do not exaggerate, and don't go to any extreme. The public policies only based on subjectivity. I don't know any case, and this is not the recommendation. I know there are paradoxes, there are expectations, there are scores, ranking that show they are different. Like Pablo's example with English as a second language. What happens if you don't make decisions? Eduardo Laura on quality beyond fact. He has shown this paradox on expectations, ranking quality of education in Chile compared to higher education in Honduras. Well, Honduras people are much more satisfied with their quality of education. But if you truly go to the fact, Chilean education is much better. So you need to compare. You need to make correlations and get to see other data that will help making decisions, and also uses and advantages of citizens' perception throughout the whole cycle of policy making, when planning policies, when selecting the best ways of intervention in terms of territory, time, in ways of intervention in order to be able to monitor and make decisions and to follow results and outcomes, and finally to get to see if the impact was achieved through that public policy. So what I want to present in the second part of my presentation is some results on perception for the Como Vamos network. In Colombia, there are 11 cities with this Como Vamos model. Bogota is the one with the longest time, 17 years making this survey and measuring also hard data. Como Vamos, how we are doing, is characterized by two lenses to get to see public policies and quality of life in the city. From one side, we have hard data from government, and the other is a perception of the citizens, and this allows a balance. I will present to you some pieces of information about Bogota and a comparison among these 11 cities. We have 11 cities, but they include more than 50% of Colombia's population, and this is very relevant. This is a sample that turned out to be very relevant. So here we have two questions, classical questions that are normally done. Things in Bogota, are they on the right path? Having such a question allows us, with 11 cities, allows us to make analysis on what people have been thinking about how things are going in the city. And there's another question: how proud do you feel about your city right now? And there is the correlation that allow me to present and explain this level of pride that is reflected by belonging, this sense of belonging to the city, getting engaged or not to public policies offering, but also in terms of citizenship participation or engagement. And we get to review city by city. We found different data. Medellin is the most optimistic city in terms of thinking that their city is on the right path. This is a city that has undergone very interesting transformation. In Cartagena and Bogota, people are more pessimistic and they think, no, this is not going as well. So move on. Another question, very interesting. Do you consider yourself as poor? Do you think you're poor? And it is important. Bogotan people think Bogota is not on the right path, but their perception of poverty is less. People who don't consider themselves as poor, it is 34% today. And this can be seen as well on how we are doing, has to do with geography as well. We can see based on specific locations, we can identify where people consider themselves poorer and why. But also, if you talk about Bogota, you go to the network, you can compare it to other cities. Those who expressed feeling poor, the lowest is Bucaramanga, and it matches exactly with the hard data that relates to the studies and hard data provided by the Statistical Institute. And we have Barranquilla and another city. And other things, the survey always brings together many things. Here I have some samples on topics that are important when listening to the citizen's voice to make decisions. For example, coverage of utilities and public cities. Those who expressed feeling poor, the lowest is Bucaramanga, and it matches exactly with the hard data that relates to the studies and hard data provided by the Statistical Institute. And we have Barranquilla and another city. And other things, the survey always brings together many things. Here I have some samples on topics that are important when listening to the citizen's voice to make decisions. For example, coverage of utilities and public services. This is for a certain amount of services that are measured with the perception. Coverage with utilities today, if you compare this to the records from public services and public companies, they match in a 99%. But then there are some other information which are interesting. Cell phones, internet are growing importantly. But when you ask the people how much satisfied you are with the services, you notice that in those two services, satisfaction is dropping. I don't know if Claro got and bought Telcel, but in cellular phone, it drops from 74 to 45%, and the same it is for internet. And if we get to review this, can we continue? The 11 cities in this network is a trend. Internet has dropped from 82 to 76 in satisfaction, and cell telephony also drops. And these are messages to public policy makers and to private companies. They should sit down and review this data. Let's continue. And these are other questions that are done in detail about life satisfaction in the neighborhoods. There are general questions by neighborhoods that allow to understand how people feel, what do they think and sense about safety, about public spaces, open areas. And here we have comparisons among the cities. Who do they feel that they have better neighborhoods to live in? Medellin would be the best, and the worst, people from Cartagena. But people are asked about useful things, useful to the public policy makers. They are asked, if you are unsatisfied, what can be done? What can the government do to improve your level of satisfaction? And then we have this, like making beautiful some areas, people with art expression, and that cost nothing. And this is the best, the number one. People would say, I would feel better if young people come here to paint a wall. That gives more lives. These kind of things are very important for public policy makers. Regarding security, there's always a discussion about hard data and perception on security. But perception and security data are very useful to make decisions in a city. Continue. Let's continue.
Well, we will move forward so that we can conclude this topic. This next question has to do with displacing or commuting from one place to another. For example, last year as opposed to this year, and in comparison, could you tell me how much time you spend on the car to commute? For example, there are some cities where it's not that complex. Next slide, please. I think I skipped one. No, one more, please. This trend. This is the measured perception over time regarding public transportation and private transportation. And public transportation in Colombian cities, unfortunately, includes cars and motorcycles or motorbikes. We are invaded by bikes. And there's a trend of those that no longer take the public services and instead of that ride bikes or motorbikes. And there's a trend downward. And private transportation is going up, specifically the bikes I was referring to, the motorbikes or motorcycles. And we can work on a regression and project this. And this is a surprise. This is a linear regression. If things continue to be like this, maybe when we reach 2022 or the year 2022, we will have more people on motorbikes and the lines will be crossing. This is a regression, of course. We understand that. We have to show what could happen. But if I was the Ministry of Transportation in Colombia or any Secretary of Transportation or Mobility, I would be very concerned with private sector transportation or only private transportation, including cars and motorcycles. No city can make it. It's impossible. Of course, there's a number of complaints when it comes to time and the quality of the services, and we should consider this information to analyze this more in detail. This is the last slide I have. In Latin America, we have over 60 cities that include this type of surveys, and Pablo talked about the one that is performed in Jalisco. We also include Argentina, Peru, Chile, Brazil, well, South America completely, and now we are trying to work on other Central American cities. This is the voice of the citizen captured in a technical format. And in Colombia, we have progressed quite intensely. As a matter of fact, there's mayors. We have mayors that set forward goals so that they can improve certain issues or items. Those mayors, for example, or secretaries that have said that whenever they have a satisfaction number under the housing ministry, they will reach the numbers or try to increase the numbers. They analyze the data and then they decide upon that. So these type of studies are relevant so that it can have an impact, so that better public policies are implemented. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Carlos Cordoba from Colombia. With that last panelist, we have concluded this interesting forum. We had the chance to hear from Gallup with the worldwide Gallup survey, practically covering all the countries in the world. Very interesting. We also heard from Sergio Torres and the experience they have when applying this type of studies for decision making at a corporate level, especially for human resources. Likewise, very interesting presentations by Francisco Abundis and Pablo Parás regarding Mexico's indicators and how we should go about greater efficiency and precision when measuring objectives. Finally, the experience of Colombia, ¿cómo vamos? Colombia, how we are doing. How are we doing? This is the program in place and different indicators pertaining to cities throughout the country. We would like to thank you for your interventions, panelists, and we would like to thank the attendees. Please do not leave the room. We will have the next panel right away. We are behind schedule, and I was informed to please recommend you to stay in the room.